Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon or evening, depending on your location. My name is Frank Boye. I'm the CAF Sports Program and Project Coordinator with CAF Sports. For your information, the webinar will be recorded. The meeting will be conducted in English. We will be utilizing a translation application for those who wish to participate in French. And I did throw a link in the chat box earlier. So if maybe you don't have access to it because you've joined a little later, I'll either add it back or maybe my colleague Peter will add it in the chat. And then you can follow along with in French. Please feel free to ask questions using the chat box. And yeah, we're happy to have you tonight. Thanks for joining us. And I'm pleased to introduce to you our guest, Dr. Darrell Menard, a retired Canadian Armed Forces physician who specializes in sports medicine. He has worked with elite Canadian athletes, including Canada's Olympic team. Dr. Menard is the Surgeon General Specialist Advisor in Sports Medicine and has worked extensively with athletes from multiple sports. As part of the Strengthening the Forces team, he has worked on injury prevention and promoting active living. Without further ado, I will turn it over to our guest tonight, Mr. Dr. Menard. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Frank. Good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be able to give you this presentation this evening. I wish that we're not still in the pandemic, and this would be a bit of a different talk, but we are in it. So I was asked to talk about pandemic injury prevention advice for Canadian Armed Forces athletes. So that is what we're going to talk about tonight, and I'll just get going here. So, you know, COVID-19 has significantly altered the lives of, I would imagine there is no Canadian that hasn't been affected in some way or other. This is really especially a problem for Canadian Armed Forces athletes who for about 19 months now have had limited access to facilities, limited access to coaching, teammates, training opportunities, and of course, competition. And this, you know, Canadian Forces athletes and coaches really, because of that 19-month gap, you really need to be careful as we resume Canadian Forces sports nationally and internationally. As we start to get back to more normal times, and I'm curling these days, and our curling program, you know, we've had some things that have changed, so now we can have 2 sweepers instead of 1, and you can play without a mask. And you have to put it on when you go back into the building. But so I'm sure you guys are seeing the same things, but here are some things you need to keep in mind as you move forward. Why is this doing this? So deconditioning. Some of you, I've seen people where they've used the pandemic time frame to actually be in better shape than they were before the pandemic started. But that's uncommon. Most people, including athletes, have actually done some deconditioning. And as part of that deconditioning, they may have gained some weight. They may have lost some skills. It took me a little while to get my skills back in terms of curling. You can lose confidence. I mean, things that you used to be able to do, you're not sure about anymore. So that's an issue. And then, I mean, the deterioration of your sports fields and facilities and equipment. I mean, if nobody's done anything with your soccer pitch, for example, at your base, the groundhogs may have actually taken over, and you now have a thing that is full of holes, etc. The grass has changed, there's broken bottles on it and rocks, etc. Everybody in your program is now approximately 2 years older, which isn't that big a deal when you're 21, but when you're 39 or 41, those 2 years of lost time may actually be more than you can actually recover from. There are injuries that people will have sustained in that COVID period that they're going to have to recover from. And then some of your teams are going to have to deal with the issue of retirement. I didn't plan on retiring, but it's 2 years now and I'm on that edge, and I just don't have the motivation to be there with you guys or gals anymore on our team. So all of those things are going to put athletes at increased risk of injury. And so you really have to carefully address them. There's something going on with my computer, so you just have to pardon me. It's just the way it's working. So here's the goals that I have for tonight's talk. I want to talk about the potential impact on the Canadian Forces Sports Program. I want to review how the body responds to training. I want to present some injury reduction strategies that you can apply in your own programs, and if you're coaching into your athletes programs. I want to present a couple of smart training strategies, and then I want to remind you that individuals like this guy who's skiing, the aging athletes that we have in our system are definitely different. So I tell this to leadership all the time. Injury prevention is not a medical problem. It is not. It is a leadership issue. And you guys, the coaches in this audience and leaders on teams like team captains, it is up to you guys to start or to continue implementing injury prevention strategies and smart training in your programs if you want to keep your teams healthy. You can have the best physician in the world working with the team, and if the coach is a kamikaze pilot who's trying to destroy the team with crazy training things, the doctor is not going to be of any help to your team at all. And I have seen that. So here are some injury prevention myths. This is one of Canada's greatest athletes of all time, Andre de Grasse. He had some injury problems after the Rio Olympics, and with very careful care, he's come back to be even better than he was before then. So one of the myths is intense training injures Canadian Forces athletes. That is not true. If you meet some of the best athletes in the world, they train extremely intensely, but they've worked up to it. What injures people is sudden, large increases in their training as opposed to training intensely. So that's an issue. Stretching reduces injuries. Stretching does not reduce injuries. There's no evidence of that worldwide. Stretching may make you feel better when you go out to move, you're a little smoother, but it doesn't reduce injuries. Dynamic warm-up, like jogging before you do a run, doing some easy laps before you swim, etc., that is helpful, but not static stretching. Running shoes reduce injury rates. Regardless of whether you're wearing one of these custom-made Andre de Grasse running shoes by Puma, or you're wearing a $250 pair of Keanos by Asics, there's been over a 100-year period, the research does not show that any innovation in running shoe design has resulted in a decrease in injury rates for runners. So no matter what they tell you, you cannot, just until something changes, you can't believe this. Rest is a waste of time. Absolutely wrong. Rest is the most important thing that coaches and athletes have to juggle if they're going to be their best, because you can't succeed if you don't have rest properly balanced in your training program. More is better. Well, to an extent, but often more is usually a recipe for disaster. So Andre DeGrasse probably is now training for the 2024 Olympic Games. And he said, okay, I want to do better in the 100 meters because I won the 2, but I didn't win the 1. I'm going to triple my training. Well, that's going to destroy him. Over the next 3 years, his training is going to very, very gently move up to improve him. So more very carefully applied is fine. You've all are in the military. You've probably heard this at one point in time. I certainly did. Pain is just weakness leaving your body, which people say, with tongue in cheek, but there are some people who actually, I believe this. So pain is actually a warning sign that something is wrong and needs to be paid attention to. Otherwise, you may have long-term problems. There's another myth that there are shortcuts to fitness. If I take this dietary supplement, or if I do this meditation, or I drink this eye of newt solution, that's going to help me get there, or I'm going to wear this special equipment. There's no such thing as a shortcut to fitness. And if there were, everyone would be on it right away. And then the last one is core fitness is a waste of time. Core fitness is probably one of the most important things that any athlete in any sport can do consistently. So there are all kinds of other myths, but I just wanted to talk about a few of these with you. So pandemic cautions, okay? First thing is, for the athletes and coaches, you cannot start back where you left off. Unless you have been doing a very aggressive training program that was aimed specifically at keeping you where you were before. Very few people will have done that. So if you haven't done that, you are going to have to start off at a lower level and work your way up. Don't be that coach or athlete that tries to make up for 19 months of mistraining in the first 3 months of your resumed program, because that is a recipe for disaster. And you need to really, as athletes, you need to ensure that your fitness and your skills are solid before you move forward. So, if you're an aerial skier, if you're not ready to do what you're doing and you're doing this triple quadruple thing in the air and then landing, you're going to kill yourself. So many of you probably watched Simone Biles at the Olympics in Tokyo. She pulled herself out because she was actually finding that she had this thing she called the twirlies or whatever, and she didn't know where she was in space. And with the kind of complicated program that she performs, she was going to kill herself if she didn't know where she was in space. She'd land on her head and break her neck. So she wisely pulled out. So again, if you're in a sport where you're doing complicated skills and you don't think you're ready, then don't do that until you are ready, okay? For coaches and for athletes on a team, you need to be watching for a widened fitness gap on your team. So this guy who's skating here, he may have been super serious about his pandemic restrictions and kept himself super fit, and he's actually a better hockey player in terms of fitness than he was before the pandemic. But 5 other guys on the team, they're 15 pounds heavier. They haven't skated in 19 months, and you're going to have this big mismatch. So training those guys at this guy's level is going to really damage them. So you've got to be aware of that. And the last thing is, it is possible that some of your athletes have been damaged by COVID-19 itself. So COVID-19 does affect respiratory systems. It does affect neuromuscular systems. It does affect the cardiovascular system. So you've heard about COVID long haulers. So these are people who have had infections who are having lasting side effects. And it is possible that some of your athletes will be COVID long haulers. So, pandemic precautions after a COVID infection, symptoms can persist. So this is that long hauler thing I was talking about. And you got to understand that just like so many other things in life, the recovery rates from a COVID infection are highly individual. You will meet some people who hardly or probably didn't realize that they had a COVID infection because it didn't seem to affect them. And you will meet other people who are on life support systems and have massive damage from the inflammation that the COVID infection caused throughout their body. Potential complications that you may see in some of your athletes include, as I said before, reduced neuromuscular functioning. So their coordination and their timing can be affected. They may have had some inflammation of their heart muscle, and then after that's over, some scarring of their heart muscle, which makes it stiffer. And that stiffness can persist for a lifetime. It did in my brother-in-law. They can have fibrosis, which is again stiffening or scarring of lung tissues. They can have mental health issues. You know, it can be very depressing to be an elite athlete and then to be leveled by this illness, and then on top of all that to have long-term complications. You can have an elevated heart rate post-infection, and that can persist, and that will have an effect on your ability to do endurance things. And then the physical deconditioning. I've been sick for 4 months or 6 months dealing with this thing. I'm short of breath walking around in my house, let alone going for a bike or a run. I'm going to be badly deconditioned. So you may encounter some of these things with the athletes that you work with, or some of you athletes that are on the line tonight may have actually encountered this yourself or with your teammates. All of those potential side effects could significantly affect the performance of an athlete, whether they're in the Canadian Forces or they're not. So, as in the world of injury prevention, one of the things that is so critical is injury prevention is priceless. So this is when if you think of COVID-19 infections as an injury, because they can be injurious, you know, preventing those infections is priceless. So all of the social distancing and the masking and the immunizations that people have had, that's priceless in terms of injury prevention. And then when we're talking about just the routine, regular lives of your athletes, you know, just preventing all the other injuries to musculoskeletal tissues is very important. It is much smarter and cheaper to prevent them than to treat them. And most sports-related injuries are preventable. I mean, if these guys are playing volleyball and, you know, a meteorite goes through the roof of the building and lands in the middle of the court and, you know, busts up a bunch of people, that's not preventable. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, you know, this guy doing way too many heavy squats that he's not used to and picking up an injury to his knee. The other thing that I got to tell you from more than 35 years of dealing with sports medicine patients is there are many of them that I see that you cannot completely make better. Whether you're a surgeon or whether you're a family practice sports medicine specialist like I am, they're damaged and you can get them back to a certain point, but you can't get them back to being 100%. So if you could have prevented that injury in the first place, you would save, you know, the athlete a great deal of trouble in their sporting career and then in the life after their sports. And the stuff we're going to talk about tonight in terms of preventing injuries doesn't have to cost a thing. It's just actually really got to do with training smarter, eating a proper diet, getting adequate sleep, hydration, and, you know, resting regularly in your training programs. And that unfortunately, I recognize that doesn't sound sexy. Like, it's not like, hey, I have this wonderful product called, prevent all injuries, branched chain amino acids, and if you eat it, you'll never be injured. It isn't sexy, but it is what works. So the importance of rest. So again, in my dealing with athletes, this is probably the most common training error that athletes will make, is failing to adequately rest when they train. And many athletes are tempted to, cut things short on the recovery thing to actually try to get better faster. And then post-pandemic, athletes are going to be very tempted to try to shortcut the rest period in order to get back to where they were. Training hard is clearly important if you want to be good, but resting hard is also very important. If you don't do that, you're doomed to failure. I'm hoping that most of you realize that when you do a workout, every time you do a workout, you create micro trauma to your tissues. And it takes the body about 48 hours to heal that micro trauma. And if you get yourself adequately rested, you will have time for that micro trauma to heal and then move on. But if you don't, the micro trauma starts to accumulate and you end up developing a real injury at some point. And that micro traumatic response to being stressed is hardwired into you. It's a biological process. It's not something that you can ignore, and there are no shortcuts around it. So this is the big, those of you that coach, this is the big issue for coaches, is getting the balance between rest and stress right. And the problem is that everyone, if you had a bunch of distance runners like this guy, let's say there's 50 in your club, every one of these guys has a slightly different rest to stress ratio. So very hard to actually balance. So my recommendation to athletes who work for them by themselves, or coaches here that are coaching athletes, is you need to schedule rest and recovery into your training program. And so these guys, professional athletes, they're on the road all the time. The guys that are dealing with their rest and recovery really have to get that juggling correct, because not only do they have the fatigue of playing, but they also have the fatigue of traveling around the world. Your athletes, when they restart their program after the pandemic settles for them, they're going to need more rest than they did before the pandemic started, because they're just not going to be in the same kind of physical condition. So keep that in mind. You can't use the old rest formula you had for them. I'd really recommend that you alternate hard and easy workouts. You should be doing that in your regular program as well, but it's very, very important when you're trying to get them back from the pandemic. Alternate high and low impact days. This is really important for athletes that actually do high impact. So a runner, this guy's a basketball player. Basketball players run, they run and jump. So that's all high impact. Soccer players, same idea. It isn't so much an issue for cyclists in terms of high impact, but you get the idea. So they need to alternate those days in order to allow the 48 hours after the high impact workout for the body to actually heal. So one of the ways you can get around that high and low impact training is using cross training. So this guy does a bunch of running and jumping related stuff on Monday, and then he comes in for his basketball session on Tuesday, and they spend time working on moves, passing, pivoting, hand skills, shooting skills, etc. No running, no jumping, just all those skills. And then on Wednesday, when they's healed, they can go back to doing running and jumping kind of stuff. So With other, cross training, you can have a runner who runs, and then on the next day he actually goes out for a bike, or he walks, or he skates or something, where there's no impact. So it doesn't have to be in the same sport either. And if your athletes are really tired and they're showing it, give them a day off. You'll actually find that that ends up being more helpful than taking a tired athlete and beating them up some more in a workout session. It just really will work. And the whole idea of your program is to build the athlete up. And if you take them and they're tired and you beat them up badly in your workout, they are probably going to be broken and not built up. There's this thing called the 80-20 strategy, and some scientists they wanted to see how elite endurance athletes trained. And so they looked at elite endurance swimmers, cross-country skiers, cyclists, runners, race walkers, etc., etc. And to their utter amazement, what they found was that about 80% of the time, these athletes, and these were world-leading athletes, trained quite easily. And then 20% of the time, they really worked quite hard. But they were shocked. One of the researchers went for a run with one of these world-class ladies, and she got to a hill and she walked up the hill, and he thought, why are you doing that? She said, I'm not supposed to work hard today, and that will bring my heart rate up too high. So she walked up the hill and then carried on with her easy run. So this 80-20 balance really shows how important the balance between work and rest actually is in producing and maintaining world-class endurance athletes. So sometimes the message can be slowing down can actually help your athletes go faster. More isn't always better. We talked a little bit about that, but for some athletes, the mathematics works this way. If I train three times harder, pardon me, I'm going to be 3 times fitter, which on the surface seems to make sense, but it's actually wrong. What that actually is going to do is probably increase your risk of being injured by 3 times. And so it's just something you cannot do. Now, this swimmer, if you took him in the beginning of a program and maybe worked him over 4 years, at the end of the 4th year, he may be able to work 3 times harder than he did when he first started, but he's not going to get there in the first couple of months of his training program. And the other thing is, you got to understand that not only are there physical stresses that come with working athletes hard, but there are psychological stresses that come with that as well. And athletes need to be prepared for that. They need to be built up to being able to handle the loads of training hard and punishing themselves so that they can get ready to actually race at a high level. So I want to give you, if this is for those of you that are really interested in coaching and are interested in as athletes and how training actually works, this is a very important slide. So the load adaptation cycle. So when you do a workout, you stress or load the body. Okay, so you all know that. And that creates fatigue and tissue breakdown. And we've already mentioned micro trauma. And there is no such thing as a workout where you do not experience micro trauma. You don't have to be aching and to have micro trauma. Then you need to rest, refuel, rebuild, rehydrate, and recover from that particular workout. When you do that adequately, you're going to adapt and have greater capability. And then you go back in and you keep this cycle up of going, stress, adapt, stress, adapt. If you don't get adequate rest, refueling, and recovery, then the fatigue and micro trauma build up, and you end up with a legitimate full-blown injury that will take time to recover, and then you're going to have to take time off to rest and rebuild anyway because the injury demands that. So you're better to get it before you're actually injured. So as I said to you earlier, this is how you're designed. It's not a flaw, and there's nothing you can do to change it. It's just the way you're made. And if you get it right, if you can juggle this rest, stress cycle, well, good things are going to happen for you. If you get it wrong, bad things are going to happen. And that's just the nature of the beast. So when you're dealing with your own programs and when you're dealing with athletes, you know, all the workouts really come down to, you know, three important training variables: the duration of the workout, the intensity of the workout, and the frequency of the workout. And that's your training load, your training workload, okay? So, you know, you meet some athletes where, you know, sprinters, you know, I was a distance runner. We'd be on the track grinding out miles and miles and miles of training, and the sprinters seemed to be warming up all day long. They'd run up 100, maybe 2 100s, and then they were done, you know. But they were training, those hundreds were pretty hard, but they really didn't do a lot of training, but they did it quite frequently. So, but like we talked about earlier, that myth about training intensely injures Canadian Forces athletes. It isn't. It's this rapid increase in this training workload that actually is the common reason for athletes being injured. And if you can gradually build them up in terms of duration, intensity, and frequency, they're going to do just fine. The other thing that's really important is training consistently. So, you know, you can't come out and do a workout and then miss the next 7, and then come out and do another 2 and then miss the next 10 and expect to be doing really well, at least not at an elite level. You might be very talented and be able to do it at a base level, you know, but you're not going to make it in CISM, and you're not going to make it at an international civilian event either. So going back, you know, sticking with adaptation rates, your tissues and your organs adapt to being stressed at different rates. So not only do individuals adapt to stress differently, you know, than other individuals, but even within an individual's body, their organs adapt at different rates. So the heart and lungs adapt very rapidly when you start using them. But muscles, tendons, and bones, and ligaments and fascias and other things, they adapt quite slowly. And so when you start training, you see people and they go, "Oh, I've got my breath. My breath is great. I've got it. I can train much harder." Usually that comes around the time when the muscles and tendons and bones are actually at their weakest. So you're feeling great, you know, you're ready to go, and you start pushing, and then you end up injuring these structures for that reason. So this is just this recipe for disaster. And I don't know why we're designed that way. Maybe one day, you know, we'll find out, but right now we do not know. So when you are training people, you're going to find that it's about 4 to 6 weeks. That's the point where your heart and lungs are really ready to go, and your musculoskeletal system is actually at its weakest, and that's where people are the most vulnerable to be injured. And when I was in China a bunch of years ago, and they showed basic training from all these countries over the world, and every one of them showed a big spike in injury rates in their 4th week of basic training, because all the recruits weren't used to what they were doing, and boom, this big spike. It was interesting because some enlightened countries put a rest week in the 3rd week after they saw this, and that spike in the 4th week didn't happen, and things were much, much better for them. So, like I said to you, at 4 to 6 weeks, your heart and lungs are ready to go, but your musculoskeletal systems are the weakest they've been since you started training. And so this is when you see stress fractures, particularly in basic training or for athletes that are endurance athletes, like running athletes. And it's why the workloads have to be progressed slowly and carefully. So there's another rule called the 5 to 10% rule. And the research, this used to be best practices, which means that we don't have any evidence, scientific evidence that it works, but coaches around the world have been doing this and it seems to be effective. We actually do now have research that shows that training loads for athletes should not be increased by more than about 10% a week. So if you're a runner and you're starting your runs and you do about 10 kilometers a week, the second week you should not be running more than 11 kilometers, and the third week 12, etc. Now, I don't know too many people that progress that slowly, but that is the safest way to go. I often see, like I saw a guy here in my practice about a year ago, and he came in and he couldn't figure out why he was injured, and he hadn't run in 15 years. In the first week he ran 20 kilometers, the next week he ran 40 kilometers, and the next week he ran 60 kilometers. And he comes in injured, and it was quite easy to pick out the cause, but he didn't really see it coming. This 10% rule is not an absolute. I mean, you meet athletes where they have to progress more slowly than that, 5%. And when you see an absolute world-class athlete, some of them, I was fortunate enough to work with Christine Gerard when she won her Olympic gold medal in London. And she increased her 2 lifts, her clean and jerk and her snatch lift combined, by 3 kilometers over 4 years. You can imagine how tiny an increase that is for an athlete. 3 kilograms of extra weight lifted, and it took 4 years to achieve that. So you can imagine how tiny her progression would have been, like some, just 0.00 or whatever. But this rule applies to all athletes regardless of how good they are. They are going to have some level where you need to keep them at, and do not progress them more than 10% a week. This can be really challenging when you're dealing with athletes at varying fitness levels. So when you start back with your sports teams and your CISM teams, you got to be careful, because as I said, some of your athletes will be very fit and others are going to be much, much less fit, and you can't give them team workouts and keep progressing them 10%, because that won't work for everybody. Protective strategies. So here's the second really critical slide that I want the athletes in the audience and the coaches to understand. Your body has a limited ability to absorb impact loads. So you take this guy. This guy could be the best box jumper on the planet, bar none. You put a weight vest on him like this, and then you make him, he normally jumps 100 jumps a day like this. And you make him jump, you just keep going. You make him keep going. Eventually, you're going to get to a point where he's going to fracture either his femurs or his fibs, just because the bones won't actually be able to handle that load. So there's a limit to this. When you exceed that limit, you're going to see a significant increase in the risk of injury for athletes. And so it's very important when you're dealing with athletes that do impact sports that you control the amount of loads that they're absorbing to manage their injury risk. And this approach is particularly important now, when you're going to be seeing athletes who are coming back to you who haven't been doing as much impact activity as they need to do to be good in their sport. So let's take a look at this guy. We're going to pretend he weighs 70 kilograms, and he's a runner. And every time this guy's foot hits the ground, his body is absorbing 2 to 3 times his body weight. So somewhere between 140 and 210 kilograms of absorption every time his foot hits the ground. If he does a 10K run, the math is as follows. 70 kilograms times 2.5, we'll say, times 10,000 strides equals 4.1 million pounds of impact load every 10K run. Okay, now that's, the Americans just approved their Build America Back, infrastructure budget, 1.2 trillion. So 4.1 million doesn't sound like a very big number, but let's show you just how big that number is. So this is a Leopard tank. It weighs 62.5 tons. And so that guy, when he did his 10K run, absorbed the equivalent of 33 Leopard main battle tanks on his body, those knees. And when you look at knees, the internal structure of knees, the cartilage on the inside and the outside, joint spaces of your knees are approximately 10 millimeters thick, and they need to last you a lifetime, as you torture them, because we don't actually have, we can replace your knee, but we don't have any real meaningful way of replacing the cartilage in your knee yet. Someday we will, but hopefully that comes soon. But the whole point is 10 millimeters of cartilage are absorbing 33 Leopard tanks worth of shock absorption every 10K run. That's a big number. Dealing with the heat. So hot weather training is physiologically and psychologically stressful, especially if you're not accustomed to it. And during acclimatization, your body becomes more efficient at handling heat stress, not more capable of handling, like no cell is more capable of handling heat. So at 42 degrees Celsius body temperature, cells start to die. So much the same as your car. Your car has a radiator. Your radiator does not allow the car to actually, the metal of the car to say, well, the metal in this car with the radiator, it doesn't melt at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. No, it still does. It's just the radiator keeps it from getting to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. So you need to acclimatize if you're going to be dealing with athletes in heat, and it takes several weeks to acclimatize, not several hours. So you can't just sit in a sauna on the aircraft going from Valcartier in January to Botswana. You're not going to be acclimatized. You need to have a number of weeks. In hot weather, make sure that you allow your athletes to drink before, during, and after their workouts. If your athletes are working out for less than an hour, they really don't need anything more than water. Some of them will prefer an energy, like a sports drink, pardon me. But if you are exercising for more than an hour, something with electrolytes and sugar, like a sports drink, is probably a better choice. And just remind your athletes that energy drinks and alcohol are dehydrators. They are actually making your hydration problem worse than they are helping it. Training in the cold. I don't know about you. I went on a bike ride this morning. It was the first bike ride that I had to wrap my feet in plastic in order to keep them from freezing on me. But you can train safely through the Canadian winter if you use some very basic strategies. So one is dress in layers. One of the things that somebody said to me a number of years ago is today there's no such thing as bad weather, it's just bad clothing. So they make some fantastic clothing that's light and very, very thermal friendly. Gore-Tex keeps the water out, the wind out, etc. So get good lightweight thermal clothing. If the roads are icy, you might be smarter to stay inside and do your workout. And if you're a guy and the wind is blowing hard, carry a plastic bag in the pocket of one of your jackets, and you can slide it down the front of your pants. It'll prevent you from getting penile frostbite. And as a distance runner, believe me, I've experienced this wonderful phenomenon, and I would rather avoid it in the future. On windy days, obviously wear a windbreaker. Do the first half of your workout into the wind, and then come back with the wind at your back, because that's when you're going to be doing the most sweating, is coming the second half. Or find sheltered trails. This is a real pet peeve of mine, and it's athletic visibility. So this is I found this picture a few years ago, and it's just a fantastic picture for me because it says everything in one shot. It's winter. This guy or gal is completely black in their coloring of their clothing. They have no reflective materials on their clothing. They are running in the middle of the road. They are just starting to go downhill, and guess what? There's a car coming behind them. And I don't know about you, but I have gone by people in my car on a bike or running, and they were absolutely invisible. And so I have stopped and said to them, do you realize I cannot see you? You shouldn't be out here without something on you, So JPS just stands for just plain stupid. So this is just plain stupid. So if you are exercising in no or low light conditions, and many soldiers, they're busy and they say, listen, I get my exercise running from home to the unit and running back at night, and in the winter or the fall, the sun is up late and sets early. I'm running in the dark both ways. So there's all kinds of reflective clothing, bands that you can wear. Your shoes can light up. You can carry reflective decals on you. You can carry lamps. You can wear headlamps, vests, etc. But make sure that you are visible, or your athletes are visible, because this guy lighting up like this, the research shows this car that's coming down the road has now got double the time to stop, because they'll see this person so much sooner. Safe training areas, we talked about that in relation to COVID-19. This might be your soccer pitch now after the COVID-19, well, as this pandemic continues. There's been an earthquake, so it's shifted and it's now on its side. You have this wonderful collection of shrubberies growing on your soccer pitch, and there may be all kinds of holes in it. And so, ensure that your facilities haven't deteriorated during the pandemic before you get your athletes out on them. And that is a very important injury prevention thing. Safety equipment. Ensure your equipment hasn't deteriorated during the pandemic. Some of the plastics and insulating material on helmets and other things, they deteriorate over time. And so you put it on and you go, this thing's falling apart. The other thing is, this equipment only works when it's worn. So I see people all the time, families, they're out for a bike ride. Mom and dad are not wearing helmets, and the kids are all wearing helmets and knee pads and elbow pads. And I want to stop the parents and say, if you fall off that bike and get a really bad head injury, who's going to take care of these kids? You should be wearing the helmets. Your kids should as well, but you should be wearing helmets because you need to be there for them. There's all kinds of equipment that has been shown to be effective for injuries. Face shields in hockey. I haven't sewn a hockey player up in about 11 years. Mouth guards are very good for protecting teeth. and oral structures, they really aren't that good at preventing concussions. Helmets don't really prevent concussions either. They prevent skull fractures and lacerations. Wrist guards are important. Semi-ankle braces or semi-rigid ankle braces will help with sports like soccer, lateral sports like soccer, basketball, and volleyball. So remember, I told you about JPS, so smart training strategies. This is just plain stupid. This guy's doing a pistol squat in Vibrams, footwear, balancing on a kettlebell with about, I don't know, 150, 175 pounds over his head. So he's either going to fall and dislocate his shoulders, hurt his back, tear the ACL in his knee, break his ankle or whatever. This is just showing off. This is actually not being smart. So we talked about warm up, and I told you that, or we talked about stretching, pardon me. Doing a specific dynamic workout before every workout is an important way to get ready, to get going, and to prevent injuries. Stretching doesn't do it. So like I said, specific dynamic. So dynamic meaning moving. If you play basketball, then you're going to do different kinds of dynamic drills than if you're a swimmer. If you're a swimmer, you're going to do different dynamic drills than if you're a high jumper. Carefully progress all your new training by no more than 5 to 10%. Remember the 80-20 rule for endurance athletes, 80% easy, 20% intense. Core training. This young lady was on the Olympic team in 2012. This is the best picture I can tell you of how important core strength is. She was a heptathlete, and I mean, that's just the best advertisement for core strength you can have. Try to get your athletes to avoid forward flexing exercises, such as doing repetitive toe touching. And if you are going to do stretching, there's nothing wrong with it. Hold them for 30 seconds and do them at the end of the workout when your body is the warmest. So some of you are female athletes and some of you work with female athletes, and they face some unique risks compared to guys. So the very huge energy demands of intense training and having a low body weight that's required in some sports. So a good example would be a female distance runner, puts them at risk of developing, they used to call it the female athletic triad. Now they call it REDS with an S. So relative energy deficiency in sports. And the basic idea is that these ladies are not getting, because of the demands of their training and the need to stay light, they're not eating enough to meet the energy demands of their training. So they develop disordered eating as a result of that. They have menstrual dysfunction. Many of them stop having periods completely. It doesn't matter what age you are. You could be. I had a 21-year-old distance runner in my office who had the bone age of a 75-year-old woman because she hadn't had a period in about 2 or 3 years because of her training. So you need proper menstrual functioning to have maintain your bone mineral density. When you are 21 and you stop having periods because of your training, you are essentially menopausal. And you can come out of that, by reducing your training and eating more, but you are menopausal at that point in time. And reduced bone density really increases the risk of developing stress fractures and osteoporosis for ladies. And so you got to understand that while energy availability is going to vary from day to day, like I ate more today than I did the other day, that's not the big issue. It's the long-term deprivation of energy. And the effects on the menstrual cycle occur after months, not after 1 day of not eating properly. And the effects of deterioration of your bone mineral density, they may not show up for years after this has been occurring. And they often will present as a stress fracture of the pelvis for women distance runner, which is what this other young lady did in my office. Strength training, very important issue in injury prevention for most athletes. And I put this picture in deliberately because there's the impression that, strength training is usually for dudes. And you're going, no, not in the world that I've been working in with elite women athletes. It's so important for female athletes at every level to work on their strength just the same as the guys do. It will enhance your performance. Not only will it prevent injuries, but it'll enhance performance in terms of more speed, more power, more strength, more endurance, more agility, and more balance. You'll just be a better all-round athlete. And it needs to be done consistently. You can't just, as I said, do strength training once every 2 weeks and expect this to be effective. It really won't. You need to progress it slowly. You can't just go into the workout and beat the living crap out of yourself every 2 weeks and expect to benefit from that. And it will take years of doing this to reach the maximum benefit that you can get from this program. So you have to be in it for the long term. And when we say strength training, we're not just talking about lifting weights. So this guy's doing rope work, but rope climbing, calisthenics, using your own body weight, jumping, etc. Make sure when you're doing this type of work that you work both sides of your joints. You're not just working your quads. You got to work your quads and your hamstrings. You got to work your biceps and your triceps, etc. But this type of stuff is important in virtually every sport. And I don't know how many of you follow curling, but 40 years ago, curling was a sport where they were drinking and smoking on the ice while they were doing the Briar type of thing. Today, if you look at an elite women's and an elite men's curling team, they are really buffed up. To sweep properly, you have to be a very powerful athlete to be an effective sweeper. And you'll see that change in those athletes across the world in curling. Aging athletes. So for the coaches in the audience, the pool of Canadian Forces personnel you're drawing your athletes from is aging. Maybe not as old as this guy, but they are aging. And here's the stats. Militaries worldwide are aging, but in the Canadian Forces, 77% of the military, Canadian Forces, is 30 or older. 37% are over 40, and 12% are over 50. And when you actually do the math, the Canadian Forces now has 14% more personnel over the age of 40 than they have under the age of 30. That's a staggering number. So you are, as coaches, you are having a smaller and smaller group of people to draw your athletes from, unless you're interested in older athletes. The Canadian Forces Recruit School are getting recruits coming into the program who are in their 50s. The oldest recruit that they have brought in to train was 57 years old. So again, this dynamic is changing. Why is this important to talk about? Well, this guy, if he's an athlete, he's different than your younger athletes, and not just because his birthday, he's 90 years old. It is different in a lot of other ways. So some basic facts about aging. It's inevitable. Every one of us is older than we were when I started talking tonight. It's genetically innate. It's not a pathological thing. Getting older is not a disease. It's the way you're programmed. And the rate of aging is highly individual and depends on genetics, lifestyle, and disease. You will meet some guys like a Jaromir Jagr who could play hockey, I think he was 47, he was still playing in the NHL. And you meet other athletes where they kind of tapped out, when they were in their mid 30s. They just couldn't keep playing. there's a linear decline in functional reserve. So your body systems start to, all of them start to actually decline in function around the age of 30, but it is extremely small, the age-specific loss. Most of the loss is actually occurring because of disuse. So you're just, you lost 5% of your function this year, but it was your genetic loss, program loss was less than 1%. The other 4 point something percent is because you weren't as active as you used to be. So here's Pierre Harvey and Alex Harvey, both world-class cross-country skiers for Canada. But they are now in his prime. This is Dad. I'm not sure how they would have compared against each other because Alex was pretty high level, but so is Pierre. But they're different now. So Pierre is different structurally, he's different physiologically, and he's different psychosocially than his son is. And just to sum up these changes, if you look at this old car and you look at this older man, so both of them, the motor, in his case, heart and lungs, they have a lower RPM. He just cannot work as hard as he used to be able to do. The carburetor doesn't supply as much oxygen to this working organism as it used to. The fuel lines don't provide as much fuel as they used to. The computer up here is slower and multitasks less well. And the chassis is less flexible, weaker, and more brittle than it used to be. The bottom line is decreased performance and an increased risk of injury when they train. The psychosocial differences for older athletes, they often have much greater time demands than younger athletes. And, I'm a 19-year-old, newly minted member of the Canadian Forces. I don't have a girlfriend, I don't have a wife, I don't have kids, and I'm a great hockey player, so that's all I do. But one of my teammates is 29 years old. He's a warrant officer. He's got 5 kids, a mortgage, etc. So they got family needs are different, professional responsibilities are different, financial commitments are different. I gotta pay for my kids' education and the mortgage and the car and social pressures. I'm an important person in my unit. I've got to go to mess dinners. I've got to go to social functions. I've got to be involved in a bunch of other things that this 19-year-old guy who joined the military a couple of days ago doesn't have to do. And not only do these things distract me from training, it makes it harder for me to get out, but they actually drain energy from your body. And that actually really reduces your ability to train and your motivation to train well. So I like this picture because, this is what this guy has to deal with in his life, and he's got to devote a bit of energy to all of those things. They also have different injury patterns. So older athletes are vulnerable to 3 sets of injuries. Old injuries coming back to haunt them. So I injured my knee when I was 20 with an ACL injury, and 20 years later I now have arthritis in my knee, which is exactly what happens with ACL people. Cumulative wear and tear. I've just been hard on my body my whole life. I've seen a number of special operations soldiers that have come into the clinic, and they've just destroyed a whole bunch of different structures in their body that have just eventually worn out. And then injuries from their current training. So this guy clearly has taken pretty good care of himself. Looks like he's about 55 years old, and he's going to strain his back today doing this weightlifting program. So he's got some old injuries, some wear and tear, and a new injury. Younger athletes generally get injured doing risky things. I often say stupid things, like they're greater risk takers. So they develop strains and sprains and dislocations and fractures. And the older athletes are usually the victims of degenerative things that we call itises. So you get arthritis, tendonitis, fasciitis, etc., etc. So they're not mutually exclusive, but as a general rule, that's how they would split out. So older athletes will heal well, but they will heal slower. So this guy, I don't know how old this guy is. He looks like he's about 100 years old, but boy, I'll tell you, he looks intense. And, you know, one of the problems for the older athletes is they often have other medical conditions that can complicate their recovery. So yes, I tore the meniscus in my knee, but I also have a fair bit of arthritis in that knee, and I've had it there for the last 10 years. And that does complicate the management, the medical management of somebody who has that type of complication. They also experience connective tissue stiffness. So I don't remember when I was younger, watching a movie for 2 hours on the couch and then getting up and feeling like I was about 30 or 40 years older, but I get that now. I stiffen up when I sit for too long. And that's an issue for all aging performers. And it also has an effect on how they're trained, how they're managed, because if this guy dislocates his shoulder, my biggest concern is how stiff this shoulder is going to become real quick. Whereas if he was 15 years old and dislocates his shoulder, my concern is, will he ever stiffen up and have a stable shoulder again? I've never seen a frozen shoulder in anybody under the age of 40. So that just shows you a little bit about connective tissue issues. So there's concerns. So, instant results. I see this frequently. It took me 30 years to get out of shape, but I want to reverse all of that in 3 months. And that'd be really hard for Superman. And I had a guy who was 67 and he wants to climb to the base camp of Mount Everest. And he wants to do that in 6 weeks' time. And he's currently walking 20 minutes a day in my town. My town is as flat as a pancake could possibly be. And so you got a 67-year-old guy who walks 20 minutes a day, and he doesn't do anything involving hills, and he wants to climb to the base camp of Mount Everest. So this guy wanted instant results, which is not going to happen. That's also a very unrealistic expectation. So some guys you will meet who think that, I used to do this easily when I was in my 20s, and now I'm in my 50s, and I'm going to be able to do it just the same. And they're in for a real shock when they find out that 30 years of rust has accumulated. There are lots of competitive opportunities for aging athletes now. And so you are seeing aging athletes who used to just do it for fun, and now some of them are overtraining. And some of them are actually even using performance-enhancing drugs to be able to perform better. And then you have this thing called the sins of the past coming back to haunt you. So here's a guy who obviously enjoys his motorcycle and more because of the money spent on the bike. In his 20s, he wanted to be huge, and I think he succeeded. And in his 30s, he wanted to stay strong, which he seems, he probably did. In his 40s, he's going to tell you, I just want to get healthy and stay healthy. In his 50s, he's going to say, wouldn't it be super cool if I didn't hurt today? And then I'm going to add this new one, which is in his 60s. It's going to be payback time. So this is the same guy. He's now in the Sons of Arthritis motorcycle gang and the ibuprofen chapter. Okay, so this is what you see happen to people. There is no way that you can commit all these sins in your youth and get away with it later on in life. So when you're dealing with older athletes in your programs, you got to train them a little differently. They got to start slow and progress more slowly than your young guys. They generally need to warm up more than your younger athletes will. They have to train consistently. If they don't train consistently, they'll have much more trouble. Cross-training for these guys is essential. So I've been running for 53 years now, and I have to cross train. I use a combination of running, biking, walking, and race walking. I'm okay if I do that. If I don't do that, I have way too many injuries. And they need to work on their core strength, their upper body and their lower body, as well as their core. And they need more recovery time. So you do a soccer workout with this guy, and you've got 16, 18-year-olds with them. This guy could be near death tomorrow, and these other guys went out and partied all night long, and they're ready to go again. So there's a big difference in their recovery needs. So the other thing is that aging bodies are less forgiving of training errors than younger bodies are more likely to be able to recover. So, older athletes may need to reinvent themselves. So I because of what I do for a living, I meet people who in the curling world, they want to continue curling, but they can't get into the hack anymore because of their arthritis in their knees. So now they're curling with a stick. They still like curling and they still have a lot of fun, but they've reinvented themselves using a stick. Reduce the high impact activities for some of these guys. So I don't do any road running anymore. But now they have all these wonderful things like elliptical machines. You can run in pools, bike, row. There's a liquid gym in our area where you can run in the water on a treadmill or bicycle on a treadmill, and they're anti-gravity treadmills. Get them to change their technique. Your baseball players, get them to throw underhand or sidearm instead of overhead and curl with a stick like this guy's doing. Try to get your older athletes to lower their goals. Maybe be more realistic. This guy, is an average curler. He wants to play in the Briar, and you're going, this is not going to happen. So stop trying it. You're not even a club curler. Try new sports as a last resort. Like, get them to do something else. You say, listen, you can't curl anymore. It's not working. Go swim, bike, etc. And offer age specific leagues. So in your own programs on the base, if you can offer, we call them old timers, hockey and stuff. I don't think the women's league, if you've got a women's hockey league, they're going to like being called the old timers women's league. And don't call them the old maids women's league either, but find a nice name for them, and it'll be fun and safer for these guys. But above all, really encourage your older athletes to keep moving and stay involved. So when your athletes start coming back to your programs, and maybe some of them have already done this, this is another Olympian, Sage. She is a 400-meter hurdler with the Canadian Olympic team. She's advertising this product. When you get back, respect all federal, provincial, and local pandemic guidelines, okay? It's very important that you do that. Remember that outdoor activities are much less risky than indoor activities. So having your guys practice soccer outside is way safer than having them play indoor soccer. All your athletes and support staff should be fully vaccinated. And we're hearing, about people who are resisting being vaccinated, etc. And that's a choice that these individuals have made, and that's fine. But, in terms of your own sports programs, in terms of safety, you can indicate that, yes, you've made that decision, but that decision has resulted in you not being able to play on our team. And our own club, our own curling club, you're not allowed to be in our club if you're not double vaccinated, and you are not allowed to curl unless you're double vaccinated. All athletes should be screened for symptoms. So again, when I come in to curl on the nights I curl, I'm met at the door, I'm screened, and if you answer positive, then you have to actually go and get taken care of before you can come back. And then have the athletes wear their masks unless they are in a situation where they're warming up, they're training, or they're competing or warming down. So we go out onto the soccer pitch, we take our masks off, we can do all that stuff. We come back into the building, into the dressing room, etc. You got to put your masks back on, okay? You're seeing right now the Ottawa Senators, they are being wiped out by COVID-19. And I don't know whether it's because the athletes have not been following this protocol properly or whatever, but they got 10 of their hockey players with COVID-19 infections. So it can happen very, very easily. Practice safe distancing. You in the dressing room, your athletes should be spread out, the coaching staff, etc. You should have personal protective equipment available and sanitation supplies in your facilities. So when your athletes come off, you need to wash the basketballs, or cleanse the basketballs, cleanse the benches, etc. These are things that you have to do if you want to keep your facilities safe. And I'm not sure how it works in a military environment, but certainly if inspectors come to see our curling club and this isn't done, we're shut down. Minimize spectators. You're still in that boat for most. And so some of the advice I'm giving to you is fluxing day to day. In Canada, again, COVID is going up, so some of these things may actually get tougher as opposed to getting softer. Minimize your sports support staff. You don't have to have 15 coaches all in the same room. You might say, listen, we're going to cut down to working with 5 coaches with the team till this is over. Have your athletes enter one door and exit through another door, and have control to the facility, access to the facility controlled so that people aren't wandering in. And then some of you may have vulnerable athletes. Athletes who are older, who some have heart disease or respiratory disease or clotting disorders, diabetes or high blood pressure, and some of them may even have cancer or an immunosuppressed condition, and they're still in uniform. And there are times when you can have certain things and you don't have any real employment limitations, but it still puts you at risk from infections like COVID-19. So to summarize, please follow the back to sports advice. Keep yourself safe and your teammates safe. If you catch a COVID-19 infection, you may be one of those fortunate people who has no long-term consequences, but you may also be someone who has devastating side effects and devastating long-term side effects. You got to understand that this is a new infection, so we know a lot about it now because a lot of work's gone in, but we don't know everything about this disease, so we're not sure what is going to happen to people 10 years down the road after they've had an infection. It took more than a year, I'm predicting to you, it's going to take another year or more for your sports program to recover once you actually start to be able to do more. So I think it's unrealistic for you to expect anything sooner than that. There are no shortcuts, so don't even think about it. Just work steady and smart at this. And athletes, the athletes that are in the audience, you've just got to understand it's going to take time for you to return to being fit and to have your skills return. I think right now, the way these things are going, you really should be working hard to get yourself fit, because hopefully, in a number of months, we're going to get a green light and you're going to be able to go full tilt on your programs. And you should be ready for that. You shouldn't be standing still and going, oh, I never saw this coming, Employ smart training strategies in everything that you do, okay? And be patient, please. You will get better, and your sport is going to survive COVID-19. So Frank, that's all that I have. I don't know if there are any questions from anybody in the group or from you, I'd be happy to answer those if anybody has any.
No, I'm good. First off, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Menard, again for providing us with this wealth of information. I'm pretty sure that whether the athletes, coaches, administrators, or officials that have joined us tonight were able to get some valuable information out of your talk. But with that said, if anyone, if you have a question, please feel free to either put it in the chat or simply unmute yourself, open your camera, and Dr. Menard will stay available for likely another 5-10 minutes. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask away. Thanks. I'm just going to look at the chat. Oh, yeah. Maxime, vas-y, Maxime.
Good day. I'm a
Hello.
soccer athlete.
Yes.
And my question is towards flexibility. What do you think flexibility can work towards injury prevention? Or is it a myth? Or
No, I don't think, again, it is funny, Maxime. I've seen athletes who are working. I've never met a gymnast that wasn't flexible, but I have met soccer players that were really good who have never seen their toes, let alone touch them, and they do fine. So there are some athletes where they just, I don't know how they cope, but they manage to do it. But as a general rule, I think that remaining flexible is a very important part of most sports. Soccer is a very dynamic sport. Did you see that bicycle kick that one of the Canadian team members rang off the crossbar the other night?
of course I did.
Yeah, well, you can't do that unless you're flexible. So I would try that. First of all, I would tear my hamstring off trying it, and then I would break my back landing on the ground. But the point is that you can't get into those types of positions if you aren't a flexible person. So I do think there's wisdom in that. I also think that you need to actually protect your flexibility with strength around the joints that you're working on. So yes, you're a super flexible guy, but you can get into positions where, gee, I don't have much strength out in this position, and in a contact sport like soccer, you can get hurt. So yes, flexibility is important, but you got to make sure that you have the strength to back it up as well. Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks a lot.
Okay.
I have another, just a general question, Dr. Menard. Someone is asking if we would be able to access the recording and share it to maybe other people or colleagues that weren't able to attend tonight. So I don't know if you would be all right with us doing so.
I'm very comfortable with that.
Okay.
I am. To be honest with you, I would greatly appreciate that, because the more people that actually hear about some strategies to prevent injuries, the better.
All right.
So thank you. You're doing me a favor by doing that, not the other way around.
Okay, so what we'll try to do on our end is probably try and get the recording, and we'll see if we could add it to our YouTube page or something like that. So yeah.
Okay.
All right. Anyone else have any questions for Dr. Menard?
So I think it looks like we're good, eh?
I think we're good. Yeah. Unless
so Frank,
yeah.
I want to thank you and your team for allowing me the opportunity to talk to your athletes and coaches. And I really hope that some of the stuff that I shared with them will help them in their own programs and their programs for their athletes. And I wish them all the best as we all try to deal with the complications that the pandemic has created in our lives and our sporting lives.
Perfect. Thanks for leaving us with these great words, Dr. Menard. I'm going to thank you once again, and thanks to you, the participants, for joining us tonight. Hopefully it was a valuable presentation, and like we said, we're looking forward to being able to share with anyone that wants to have a look at it. And we're wishing you a great evening. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.